As I walked into the house and headed straight for the bedroom, Angela's laughter from the other room froze mid-sentence. The sound of the closet door opening must have drawn her in because moments later, she stood in the doorway, her face pale but defiant. "What the hell are you doing?" she yelled, her voice cracking as she saw me packing my things. I didn't stop or even look at her. "What I should have done a long time ago," I said calmly, my voice steady even as my heart raced. Her protests echoed behind me, but I was already gone emotionally, if not yet physically. But before we dive deeper into this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next chapter. The third item left up is that there seems to be like Jerry Thornhill wasn't sure when his life had become so predictable. At 48, he often felt like a character in someone else's story, a background extra in a world that had long since stopped feeling like his own. Every morning, his alarm clock buzzed at precisely 6:15 a.m., signaling the start of another day filled with deadlines, meetings, and software glitches he no longer cared about solving. His job as a senior software engineer had once sparked ambition, but now it only brought the steady hum of boredom. After all, Jerry's marriage to Angela, once vibrant and filled with laughter, had faded into a routine of polite conversations and separate worlds. They moved through their shared suburban home like ghosts, careful not to disrupt the fragile peace. Evenings were spent in silence, the TV murmuring in the background as they scrolled through their phones. Dreams of becoming a writer and living a quiet life in the mountains still lingered in Jerry's mind, though they felt as distant as peaks he used to fantasize about. A folder on his laptop titled Untold Stories contained countless beginnings of novels, each abandoned when life's demands pulled him back to reality. Still, Jerry carried on, convincing himself that stability mattered more than passion. He was the dependable husband, the reliable father, the steady provider. But as the days blurred into one another, an undeniable truth pressed against the edges of his mind. Something had to change, or he would suffocate in the monotony. Though Jerry preferred to ignore it, a crack had long since formed in the foundations of his marriage. Angela was distant in ways he couldn't explain but could always feel. She often retreated to their bedroom early, citing headaches or exhaustion, leaving Jerry to finish dinner with their children. When they spoke, her words were clipped, as though she had a finite supply of patience reserved for other people. Jerry couldn't deny the growing strain at home. His 17-year-old son, William, had become a stranger, hostile and dismissive, perpetually glued to his phone or storming out of the house to meet friends. Jerry didn't approve. William had been caught skipping school twice this month, and Jerry suspected there was more he didn't know. His daughter, Laura, was quieter but no less troubling. At 14, she oscillated between moments of sharp defiance and an eerie withdrawal that left Jerry wondering if she was okay. She barely spoke to him anymore, preferring the company of her friends or the solace of her closed bedroom door. There were moments when Jerry tried to bridge the gap, but every effort seemed to fall flat. A family dinner felt like a chore, filled with the clink of forks against plates and forced small talk. In his heart, Jerry feared they were all slipping away from one another, and he didn't know how to stop it. The growing distance in his marriage and the unraveling of his family felt like warning signs, but Jerry, ever the pragmatist, told himself it was just a phase, one that would eventually pass. Deep down, however, he knew better. End of chapter 33. Recording by Darren Graham. It started as an ordinary Tuesday, one of those dreary midweek days that felt neither here nor there. Jerry's morning commute was slow, his coffee lukewarm, and his inbox overflowing with tasks that barely held his attention. By mid-morning, though, a dull ache behind his eyes had grown into a persistent throb. He brushed it off at first, attributing it to stress or a bad night's sleep, but by lunchtime, the nausea set in. When his boss, a no-nonsense man with little patience for sick days, noticed Jerry looking paler, he waved him off with an unusual kindness. "You look like hell, Thornhill. Go home and rest before you infect the whole office." Jerry didn't argue. The drive home felt longer than usual, his mind foggy with exhaustion. The December air bit through his jacket as he shuffled from his car to the front door. That's when he noticed it. An unfamiliar green pickup truck parked in his driveway, its hood dusted with the faint residue of road salt. At first, he thought it might belong to a contractor or a delivery person, but a subtle unease crept in. Stepping inside, the house was unusually silent, almost oppressive in its stillness. Angela was supposed to be at work, the kids at school, yet something felt off. His shoes barely made a sound as he moved through the entryway, the ache in his head momentarily forgotten as he ascended the stairs. Muffled voices drifted from the direction of the bedroom, followed by laughter. Angela's laughter, light and familiar in a way Jerry hadn't heard in years. He froze, a chill coursing through him that had nothing to do with the winter air outside. He moved closer. The door was cracked open just enough to see the edge of the bed and the unmistakable shadow of two figures entwined. Jerry's breath caught in his throat, his world already fragile, shattered in an instant. The napkin was placed on the gravel floor beside the man, and he started as Jerry walked through the room. The heavy stillness of the house greeted Jerry as he stepped through the front door. The usual hum of daily life, the distant chatter of the TV, the sound of Angela in the kitchen, the faint buzz of Laura's music upstairs, was conspicuously absent. For a moment, he stood there, taking it in, the silence pressing down like a weight on his chest. His first thought was that he had imagined the voices and laughter outside, perhaps a trick of his feverish mind. But as he set his keys on the entryway table, he noticed small details that didn't add up. Angela's shoes, which she always tucked neatly into the closet, were tossed carelessly near the door. Her coat wasn't hanging on its usual hook, but draped over the back of the living room sofa. Moving further into the house, Jerry's footsteps were cautious, deliberate. The faint scent of cologne, unfamiliar and sharp, lingered in the air, a scent that was definitely not his own. His stomach turned, but he swallowed down the rising bile and forced himself to keep going. In the kitchen, the remnants of a hastily abandoned breakfast caught his attention. 2 coffee mugs sat side by side on the counter, their rims smudged with lipstick in a darker stain he didn't recognize. Jerry's hand hovered over one of them for a moment, trembling slightly, before he pulled it back as if burned. The details were stacking up, each one a tiny betrayal, but he didn't let himself dwell on them. As he made his way to the staircase, he strained his ears, catching faint sounds from above. A deep male voice, low and muffled, said something he couldn't make out, followed by the soft rise of Angela's laugh, a sound that used to belong only to him. His legs felt like lead as he climbed the stairs, each step measured and deliberate. the pounding of his heart almost drowning out the noises. Halfway up, the voices became clearer, punctuated by light laughter and the unmistakable intimacy of a shared joke. The realization of what he might find hit him in waves, but he pressed on, each step feeling heavier than the last. At the top of the stairs, Jerry paused, his hand gripping the banister for support. The door to their bedroom, slightly ajar, revealed a sliver of the bed and a tangled mess of blankets. He could see movement, shadows shifting against the light spilling from the window, and the sound of Angela's voice, warm and playful, cut through him like a blade. He took a slow, steadying breath, then leaned forward, the angle widening just enough for him to see what he saw stopped him cold. The world narrowed to a single, unbearable truth. Jerry's hand trembled as he pushed the door open just enough to widen his view. The sunlight streaming through the window bathed the room in an almost serene glow, a cruel contrast to what he was witnessing on the bed he had shared with Angela for years. There she was, her laughter still echoing softly as she leaned into the embrace of a man Jerry didn't recognize. At first, his mind refused to process the scene. He blinked, hoping it was some fevered hallucination brought on by his illness. But the longer he stared, the clearer it became. The man, younger and fitter than Jerry, whispered something into Angela's ear, making her laugh again as she rested her head on his chest. That laugh, once reserved for their shared private moments, now felt like a mockery, a sound that no longer belonged to him. A surge of emotions threatened to overwhelm him. Shock, anger, humiliation. They crashed into him all at once, leaving him frozen in place. His breath came in shallow gasps as his fists clenched involuntarily. He wanted to burst into the room, to demand answers, to yell, scream, anything, but his body wouldn't move. Instead, his eyes darted to his phone in his pocket, an impulse taking over. Slowly, as though afraid any sudden movement might give him away, he pulled it out and swiped to the camera. His hands shook as he framed the image on the screen, his finger hovering over the shutter button as he snapped the first photo. A strange detachment washed over him. It was as if he were outside himself, watching another man document this moment of devastation. He took another photo, and then another, each one sharper and more damning than the last. This wasn't just about proving what he'd seen. It was about creating a record, a way to convince himself later that this was real, that this was happening. Jerry's vision blurred with tears he refused to let fall, his chest tightening with the weight of betrayal. Every detail became seared into his memory. The way Angela's hair spilled over her shoulders, the sound of her voice, the way her hand lingered on the man's chest. He hadn't realized how long it had been since she'd touched him with that same tenderness. As his heart pounded in his ears, Jerry wrestled with conflicting urges. Part of him wanted to throw the door open and confront them, to demand to know how long this had been going on and why. But a quieter, colder, older part of him held him back. What would yelling accomplish? He needed to stay in control, to think clearly, to plan his next move. He stepped back, careful not to let the door creak. His retreat down the stairs felt both painstakingly slow and oddly detached. His mind swirled with fragmented thoughts. How long? Why him? Why now? But one thought stood out above the rest. This ends today. Reaching the front door, Jerry paused, his hand gripping the doorknob tightly. He took one last look around the house. the house he had worked so hard to build, the house that no longer felt like home, and walked out into the cold winter air. The images on his phone, a heavy burden in his pocket, Jerry stepped out of the house into the crisp winter air, the chill biting against his flushed skin. His breaths were shallow, his mind racing, but his body moving on autopilot. The green pickup truck was still parked there, bold and unbothered, as if mocking him. For a moment, he stood frozen, staring at the vehicle, anger simmering just beneath the surface. He glanced back toward the house, half expecting to see Angela at the window, but the curtains remained still. A bitter smirk crossed his lips. They don't even know I was here. As his eyes returned to the truck, an idea formed, petty, impulsive, but undeniably satisfying. He needed some semblance of control in a moment when everything felt like it was slipping through his fingers. Walking purposefully to his car, Jerry opened the trunk and rummaged through it until he found the small toolkit he always kept for emergencies. With steady hands despite the turmoil inside him, he crouched by the front tire of the truck and unscrewed the valve cap. The hiss of escaping air was oddly soothing, like a release valve for his own anger. One tire wasn't enough, though. He moved to the next, then the next, methodically deflating all four until the truck sat low, helpless on its axles. Jerry straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans and allowing himself a small, grim sense of satisfaction. It wasn't justice, not by a long shot, but it was something. Sliding into his own car, he gripped the steering wheel tightly as he pulled out of the driveway. He didn't look back. The motel wasn't far, and as he drove, his thoughts were a blur of plans and emotions he couldn't yet untangle. For now, he needed space. Space to think, to breathe, to figure out what came next. The motel room was as sterile and lifeless as Jerry felt. The faint hum of the heater filled the silence, accompanied by the muted light of a flickering lamp. Jerry dropped his duffel bag onto the bed and sat heavily beside it, his shoulders slumping under the weight of the day's events. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, the screen lighting up with Angela's name. He stared at it, the vibration grating against his nerves, but he didn't pick up. Instead, he swiped the call away, silencing it. Moments later, another buzz, a voicemail. Then another. Jerry sighed, letting his head fall into his hands as the notifications continued to pile up. Each one felt like a demand for attention he wasn't ready to give. Finally, when the phone fell silent, Jerry reached for it, not to listen, but to take control. He opened a blank note and began to type, his fingers shaking slightly. First, he listed what he needed to do. 1. Secure evidence. 2. Speak to a lawyer. 3. Protect finances. 4. Talk to the kids. Each step felt like a small anchor in the chaos, a way to regain some stability. Next, he began organizing the photos he'd taken. Every time he looked at them, his stomach turned, but he forced himself to catalog them into a folder labeled simply Proof. He wasn't sure yet how he'd use them, but he knew they were important. The more he wrote, the clearer his thoughts became. This wasn't about vengeance, he told himself. It was about reclaiming his life. He couldn't undo what had happened, but he could take the next steps on his own terms. As he saved the file, his phone buzzed again. A text from Angela this time. We need to talk. Please come home. Jerry stared at the words, his lips pressing into a hard line. He turned off the phone, placing it face down on the nightstand. Not tonight. Tonight was for planning. The next morning, Jerry awoke with a grim sense of resolve. He retrieved his laptop from the duffel bag and began researching. Clark Slater, that was the name on the insurance card he had glimpsed in the lover's truck. It didn't take long to connect the dots. A quick search revealed a LinkedIn profile, and from there, Jerry found more: a Facebook account, photos of Clark with his family, and, most importantly, the name of his wife, Leah Slater. Jerry's hands hovered over the keyboard for a moment, hesitating. Was this too far? But then he thought of the laughter, the betrayal, the humiliation, and his resolve hardened. He composed a short, anonymous email, attaching the clearest photos he had taken the day before. The message was brief. You deserve to know the truth. Your husband was with my wife yesterday. These photos speak for themselves. Before he could overthink it, he hit send. The message disappeared into the void, and Jerry leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. It wasn't a solution, but it was a start. The sense of control it brought was fleeting but satisfying. As he closed his laptop, Jerry allowed himself a small, bitter smile. If Clark thought he could walk away unscathed, he was sorely mistaken. As the hours dragged on, Jerry sat by the motel window, staring blankly at the parking lot outside. His mind churned with fragmented thoughts, each one sharper than the last. The life he had spent years building, the marriage, the family, the stability, had fractured in an instant. He pressed his palms against his temples, as if he could physically hold back the tide of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Regret crept in first, gnawing at him with cruel questions. How did I not see this coming? Could I have done something differently? But as the regret took root, anger soon followed, burning away the doubts with its searing heat. This wasn't just his failure. Angela had made her choice, over and over again. His gaze shifted to his phone, still face down on the nightstand. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the heater. He thought about their house, his house, and how he'd spent years working late, fixing leaky faucets, shoveling snow, all to keep it running. Now, it felt tainted, like a stage set for a lie he had unknowingly performed in. But beneath the anger and regret, a deeper sadness lingered. He thought about the first time he met Angela, how her laugh used to light up a room, how they had danced barefoot in the kitchen during their first year of marriage. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now, as though they had been stolen by the strangers they had become. Jerry inhaled deeply, grounding himself. He knew there was no going back. The life he thought he had was over, and clinging to it would only drag him further into despair. If this was the end, it could also be a beginning. The realization wasn't comforting, but it was necessary. He had to let go, no matter how much it hurt. The house felt different when Jerry walked through the door, quieter, heavier. Every creak of the floorboards and every distant sound seemed amplified. He had texted Angela earlier to let her know he was coming to gather his things. The thought of seeing her filled him with a mix of dread and cold determination. Angela was waiting in the living room, her face pale, her eyes rimmed with red. She stood as he entered, wringing her hands nervously. "Jerry," she began, her voice cracking, "please, can we talk?" Jerry didn't respond. Instead, he walked past her toward the stairs, his expression unreadable. His silence was its own statement, and it made Angela's voice rise in desperation. "It was a mistake. I wasn't thinking. Please, you have to believe me. He paused at the foot of the staircase, gripping the banister tightly. Turning to face her, his voice was low but steady. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary, Angela. 6 months of lying, that's not a mistake. That's a choice. Her tears spilled over, and she stepped closer, her hands trembling. I was lonely, Jerry. You were so distant. We stopped talking, stopped connecting. I didn't know what to do. Jerry's laugh was bitter and sharp. So your solution was him? You didn't think to talk to me, but you could laugh in his arms? That's rich. So is that why you're doing this? Because you don't want to regret it? Angela flinched at his words, her sobs growing louder. I know I messed up, but I love you. I don't want to lose you. I'll do anything to fix this. Jerry's jaw tightened as he forced himself to look at her. Love, he repeated, his voice heavy with disbelief. You don't destroy the people you love, Angela. You don't humiliate them, break their trust, and then beg for forgiveness when you're caught. Angela sank onto the couch, her shoulders shaking as she wept. Jerry turned and ascended the stairs, his movements brisk and purposeful. In the bedroom, he packed quickly, methodically, not allowing himself to dwell on the photos of their family or the little reminders of a life now shattered. When he returned downstairs, suitcase in hand, Angela stood again, blocking his path. Please, she whispered, her voice hoarse, don't do this. Jerry met her gaze, his eyes cold and resolute. You already did. With that, he walked past her, the sound of the door closing behind him punctuating the finality of his words. As Jerry reached for the doorknob, Angela's voice broke through the silence. You think this is all on me, she said, her tone sharp, cutting through her tears. Do you even realize how lonely I've been? Jerry froze, his grip tightening on the handle. Slowly, he turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Lonely? He repeated, his voice low but laced with incredulity. You had a husband, a family, a home. What part of that wasn't enough for you? Angela's eyes, red and swollen, filled with fresh tears. You were never really there, Jerry. Even when you were home, it was like you weren't. Always working, always stressed, always somewhere else in your head. I felt invisible. Jerry's laugh was bitter, a sharp contrast to her broken demeanor. So that justifies what you did? You felt neglected, so you ran straight into someone else's arms? That's your excuse? It wasn't like that, she said quickly, stepping closer to him. I didn't plan this. I didn't wake up one day and decide to betray you. It just happened. It just happened? Jerry repeated, his voice rising now, anger breaking through his usually controlled demeanor. You don't just happen to cheat for 6 months, Angela. That takes effort, lies, planning, choices. Every single time, you chose him over me. Angela flinched but didn't back down. I'm not proud of what I did, okay? But I was hurting, Jerry. I felt like I didn't matter anymore, like I was just some background character in your life. And I didn't feel the same. Jerry shot back, his voice shaking. You think I haven't felt ignored, unappreciated? But I didn't go out and destroy our family over it. Her tears spilled over again, and her voice cracked. I was scared, Jerry. Scared of losing you. Scared of waking up one day and realizing you didn't love me anymore. Jerry's gaze hardened, his jaw tightening. You didn't lose me, Angela. You threw me away. That was just what Jerry had expected from his father, and Jerry sure as hell didn't like what he found. The room fell into silence, thick and heavy. Angela stood there, her shoulders shaking, while Jerry looked at her one last time. "I can't do this anymore," he said quietly, his voice hollow. "You didn't trust me enough to talk about how you felt, and now there's nothing left to save." With those words, he turned and walked out, leaving Angela behind in the quiet house filled with echoes of what once was. The weight of the suitcase in Jerry's hand felt insignificant compared to the heaviness in his chest. He stood at the door for a moment, his back to Angela, the silence between them deafening. Behind him, he could hear her soft, muffled sobs, but he didn't turn around. He couldn't. As he opened the door, the cold winter air rushed in, cutting through the warmth of the house and chilling him to the bone. It was fitting, he thought, how the world outside seemed to mirror the icy finality of this moment. For years, he had carried the weight of their crumbling marriage, hoping that time or effort could fix what was broken. Now, as he stepped onto the porch, he realized he was done carrying it. Angela's voice came softly behind him, breaking the silence. "Jerry, please don't go." He paused for the briefest of moments, his heart tightening at the sound of her plea. But as he gripped the suitcase tighter and took another step forward, he knew there was no going back. Without a word, he closed the door behind him, the soft click echoing louder than any argument they'd ever had. As Jerry walked to his car, the house faded into the background, a symbol of a chapter that had ended. Each step away felt like shedding a layer of pain, regret, and betrayal. And though the road ahead was uncertain, it was his. The front door slammed open, and William stormed into the living room where Jerry was sorting through papers at the motel table. His son's face was red with anger, his fists clenched at his sides. "So that's it?" William snapped, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're just walking out on us?" Jerry looked up, meeting William's furious glare with a calmness that only seemed to enrage him further. "I'm not walking out on you, William," Jerry said evenly. "I'm making a choice for myself." William scoffed, pacing back and forth. "Yeah, that's real noble, Dad. Just leave Mom to pick up the pieces while you play the victim. Do you even care about what this is doing to us? To me and Laura?" Jerry sighed, setting the papers aside. "This isn't about playing the victim, William. It's about respecting myself enough to walk away from something that's broken beyond repair." "Respecting yourself?" William shot back, his voice rising. "How about respecting us? You think this is hard for you? Try being the kid whose dad bailed because he couldn't handle it." Jerry's jaw tightened. "I didn't bail, William. And don't you dare put all this on me. I didn't create this situation, but I'm not going to stay and pretend it's okay." William shook his head, laughing bitterly. "You're just running away. Typical." He turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Jerry leaned back in his chair, the sound of the slamming door echoing in his mind. He had expected anger, but William's words still cut deep. Despite the hurt, Jerry knew he couldn't let his son's rage derail his decision. Later that evening, there was a soft knock on the door. Jerry hesitated before opening it, finding Laura standing there, her eyes red from crying. She looked smaller than usual, her shoulders hunched as though the weight of the situation was pressing down on her. "Can I come in?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible. Jerry stepped aside, allowing her in. She sat on the edge of the bed, fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. "Dad," she began, her voice trembling, "please don't leave us." Jerry's heart ached at the raw vulnerability in her tone. "Laura," he said gently, sitting beside her, "this isn't about leaving you or William. I'll always be your dad." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she shook her head. "It feels like you're giving up on us, on me. I know things have been bad, but I don't want to lose you." "You're not losing me," Jerry said, his voice firm but kind. "This decision isn't about you or William. It's about me and your mom. But no matter where I go, you're my daughter, and I'll always be here for you." She sniffled, wiping her face. Jerry placed a hand on hers. "I promise." For the first time in days, he saw a glimmer of hope in her tearful eyes. It was fragile, but it was a start. The next morning, Jerry stood in the kitchen of the house for what he knew would be one of the last times. William sat at the table, arms crossed, a scowl etched across his face. Laura lingered by the counter, her eyes downcast but attentive. Angela hovered in the doorway, watching Jerry carefully, as though afraid of what he might say. Jerry set his coffee mug down with deliberate calm and took a deep breath. "We need to talk," he began, his voice steady but firm. "Not about blame, not about the past, but about what comes next." William scoffed, but Jerry ignored it, focusing on the weight of what needed to be said. "This family isn't broken because I'm leaving," Jerry continued. "It was already breaking, and no one wanted to admit it. I take responsibility for my part in that. I wasn't always the husband or father I should have been, but we're all responsible for how we move forward." Angela opened her mouth to speak, but Jerry held up a hand. "I'm not here to rehash what's already happened. I'm here to make one thing clear. I'm stepping away because it's what I need to do to take care of myself. That doesn't mean I'm abandoning you. I'm still here for William and Laura whenever they need me. But I can't fix what's broken between you and me, Angela." William's chair scraped loudly as he stood. "So what? You're just walking away because it's easier for you?" Jerry met his son's gaze evenly. "No, William. I'm walking away because staying would mean pretending everything's fine when it isn't, and that wouldn't help any of us." Turning to Laura, he softened his tone. "This isn't about giving up on either of you. It's about setting boundaries so we can all heal. You and your brother have your own paths to figure out, and I'll be there to support you. But I can't stay here and pretend I'm okay when I'm not." The room fell silent, the weight of Jerry's words settling over everyone. Finally, Laura nodded, her expression hesitant but understanding. William looked away, frustration evident, but he didn't argue further. Jerry picked up his keys and headed toward the door. Pausing, he turned back one last time. "You have to take responsibility for your choices, just like I'm taking responsibility for mine. That's how we move forward." Without waiting for a response, he stepped outside, the crisp air hitting him as he walked to his car. It wasn't an easy goodbye, but it was a necessary one. For the first time in years, Jerry felt a sense of clarity and resolve. He was exactly the man Jerry knew he was. He was ready for a new chapter. The moment Jerry walked into the office, he felt the shift in the atmosphere. Conversations abruptly halted as he passed, colleagues exchanging sidelong glances and whispered comments just out of earshot. He kept his head down, gripping his coffee mug tightly, and made a beeline for his desk. By midday, it became impossible to ignore. His usually friendly coworker, Janet, approached with a hesitant smile. "Hey, Jerry," she started, her tone overly cautious. "If you need someone to talk to, I'm here." Jerry stiffened but managed a polite nod. "Thanks, Janet. I'm fine." Her smile faltered, and she quickly retreated. Others weren't as subtle. A pair of junior employees stared at him openly from across the room, their voices too low to hear but their expressions speaking volumes. Jerry clenched his jaw, focusing on his computer screen, but the whispers and stares felt like a tangible weight pressing on him. By the time lunch rolled around, he was tempted to leave early, but he forced himself to stay. Let them talk, he thought. The truth was, he couldn't control what they thought or said. All he could do was keep his head up and do his job. Still, the pitying glances were harder to shake than he'd anticipated. That evening, Jerry stepped into the parking lot, grateful to finally escape the stifling environment of the office. The cold air was refreshing, and he took a deep breath as he approached his car. But as he unlocked the door, a voice called out behind him. "Hey, Jerry." He turned to see Clark Slater striding toward him, his face flushed with anger. Jerry's pulse quickened, but he kept his expression neutral, leaning casually against his car. "Clark," he said evenly, "didn't expect to see you here." Clark stopped a few feet away, his fists clenched. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? Sending those pictures to my wife. Do you have any idea what you've done to my life?" Jerry met his glare with quiet resolve. "What I've done to your life, Clark? You destroyed mine first. I just made sure someone else wasn't living in the dark." Clark took a step closer, his voice rising. "You're a coward. You know that? You couldn't handle your own marriage, so you dragged me down with you." Jerry straightened, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing inside. "You made your choices, Clark. I didn't force you into anything. If you're facing consequences now, that's on you." Clark's jaw worked as though he wanted to say more, but Jerry's steady gaze seemed to disarm him. Finally, Clark threw his hands up in frustration. "You're a piece of work. You know that?" Jerry opened his car door, pausing to deliver his final words. "Maybe, but at least I can look myself in the mirror." Without waiting for a response, he got into the car and drove away, leaving Clark standing in the cold. The encounter left his adrenaline surging, but for the first time in weeks, Jerry felt like he had reclaimed a small piece of his dignity. And taking a deep breath, he thought about what had been so challenging about what had happened. Jerry arrived at the small Italian restaurant feeling a mix of nervousness and curiosity. It had been years since he'd sat across from anyone other than Angela for a meal, but Marcy's invitation had been impossible to decline. She was an old colleague from a previous job, someone he'd always admired for her intelligence and warmth. They'd reconnected over a chance meeting at a coffee shop a few weeks back, and now here they were. As soon as he stepped inside, Marcy waved him over, her smile as bright as he remembered. "Jerry, it's so good to see you," she said warmly, standing to give him a quick hug. Her energy was infectious, and for the first time in weeks, Jerry felt his shoulders relax. The conversation flowed easily, with Marcy steering them away from heavier topics and toward light-hearted memories of their shared work days. Over plates of linguine and glasses of wine, Jerry found himself laughing, a genuine, unguarded laugh that felt foreign but welcome. "I always thought you were wasted in that cubicle," Marcy said suddenly, her gaze steady and sincere. "You talked about writing all the time. Why didn't you go for it?" Jerry hesitated, then shrugged. Life got in the way, I guess. Stability seemed more important. Marcy leaned forward, her expression soft but firm. Stability is overrated. You're a storyteller, Jerry. It's in you. Don't let anyone or anything convince you otherwise. Her words struck a chord, and Jerry felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, belief in himself. By the end of the meal, he wasn't just grateful for the company. He was grateful for the reminder of who he used to be. The evening stretched on as Marcy suggested they take a walk along the nearby park trail. The air was crisp, the faint glow of streetlights casting long shadows on the path. Jerry stuffed his hands into his pockets, the quiet between them comfortable but charged with unspoken possibilities. Do you remember that time we worked on the Wilkins account? Marcy said suddenly, breaking the silence. You were so calm under pressure. I thought, this guy can handle anything. Jerry chuckled, shaking his head. I think I was faking it most of the time. Marcy stopped walking and turned to him, her eyes searching his. You weren't faking it, Jerry. You've always been stronger than you think. The sincerity in her voice made him pause. He had spent so much time feeling inadequate, first as a husband, then as a father, and now as a man trying to piece his life back together. Marcy's words, simple yet profound, chipped away at that wall of self-doubt. Without thinking, Jerry reached out, his hand brushing hers. Marcy didn't pull away. Instead, she took his hand in hers, her warmth grounding him in the moment. Marcy, he began, unsure of what he wanted to say, but she interrupted him with a small smile. It's okay, Jerry. You don't have to say anything. They continued walking, their hands intertwined. When they reached the end of the trail, Marcy turned to face him, her expression tender but full of quiet confidence. You're allowed to be happy, you know, she said softly. You deserve it. The sound of wheels progressed, but for the first time in a long while, Jerry didn't feel the need to argue. Instead, he leaned in, their kiss tentative at first, then deepening as he let go of the weight he had been carrying for so long. In Marcy's embrace, he didn't just feel wanted. He felt worthy. The night ended with Jerry dropping Marcy off at her apartment, her smile lingering in his mind as he drove back to the motel. It wasn't just the connection or the intimacy that stayed with him. It was the sense that he was finally taking the first steps toward rediscovering himself. The scene unfolded at the office like a slow-moving car crash, impossible to look away from. Clark was in the middle of a conversation with a colleague when the glass doors to the lobby swung open, and Lila, his wife, stormed in. Her face was a mix of fury and heartbreak, her voice cutting through the usual hum of office chatter. "Clark," she called out, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. Heads turned as whispers rippled through the room. Clark froze, his expression shifting from surprise to dread as Lila approached. "Do you have any idea what you've done to our family?" she demanded, thrusting a manila envelope into his chest. "I got your little photos, Clark. How many other women have there been, huh?" Clark tried to usher her toward a private corner, but Lila wasn't having it. "Don't you dare try to minimize this," she spat, her voice rising. "Everyone should know what kind of man you are." By now, a small crowd had gathered, their curiosity barely masked by concern. Lila turned to them, holding up the envelope. "If you're wondering, this is proof of his betrayal, not just to me, but to his family." He's been lying to all of you. Clark's protests were weak, his voice drowned out by Lila's accusations. The office buzzed with shock and murmured judgments as Lila stormed out. Clark stood there, his usual confident demeanor shattered. His secrets, carefully hidden for years, were finally laid bare. Angela's day at the office started like any other, but the whispers began almost immediately. Her colleagues avoided her gaze, their conversations stopping abruptly whenever she entered the room. By mid-morning, the air was thick with tension, and she realized something was wrong. It didn't take long for her to find out why. A coworker she barely knew approached her hesitantly. "Angela, I thought you should know. People are talking about you and Clark." Angela's heart sank as she realized what was happening. The affair, which she thought was a secret, had become public knowledge. By lunch, it was clear she had become the subject of office gossip, her colleagues' thinly veiled pity or disdain cutting her to the core. A supervisor called her into a meeting by the afternoon, their tone professional but firm. "Angela, this situation has created a distraction for the team. We'll need to discuss next steps." Angela nodded, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of her chair. The humiliation was overwhelming, but she knew there was no one to blame but herself. The affair that had once seemed like an escape had now become a prison, its consequences inescapable and public. Jerry's phone buzzed late at night, the jarring sound pulling him from a restless sleep. Groggy, he reached for it, but the moment he saw the caller ID, City Police Department, his stomach dropped. "Mr. Thornhill," the officer's voice was firm but professional. "Your son, William, has been arrested for possession of a controlled substance. We need you to come down to the station." The drive to the station was a blur of anger, fear, and disappointment. When Jerry arrived, he found William sitting on a metal bench in the holding area, his head hung low. The boy who once begged Jerry to stay up late and watch movies now looked like a stranger, defiant yet vulnerable. "What the hell were you thinking?" Jerry's voice was low, but charged with frustration as they sat in the station's small conference room. William avoided his father's eyes, shrugging. "It's not a big deal." Jerry slammed his palm on the table, startling William. "Not a big deal? You've just landed yourself in jail, William. How is that not a big deal?" William finally looked up, anger flashing in his eyes. "You don't get it, Dad. You don't care about anything but yourself?" Jerry's chest tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "I care enough to tell you the truth, even if you don't want to hear it. You're heading down a dangerous path, and I'm not going to let you drag yourself further into this mess." William scoffed. "What are you going to do? Lecture me?" "No," Jerry said firmly. "I'm going to let you face the consequences. I'll pay for a lawyer, but you're going to court. You'll explain yourself to the judge, and if they give you community service or rehab, you're going to show up." William's bravado cracked, replaced by a flicker of fear. Jerry leaned forward, his voice softening. "You have to want to fix this, William. I can't do it for you, but I'm not going to watch you destroy your life." While William's troubles grew, Laura's transformation quietly began to take shape. At first, it was small changes, choosing to stay home and study rather than go out with friends, helping Jerry with errands when he visited. But as weeks turned into months, the shift became undeniable. One evening, Jerry received an unexpected call from Laura. "Dad, can we talk?" she asked, her voice hesitant but clear. "Of course," Jerry said, meeting her at a local diner. "Over milkshakes," She opened up in a way she hadn't in years. "I've been thinking a lot," Laura admitted, her fingers tracing the edge of her glass. "About everything. About how I've been acting." Jerry listened as she explained how she'd started seeing her own behavior in William. Rebellious, angry, and self-destructive. "I don't want to end up like that," she said quietly. "I want to do better." From that moment, Laura threw herself into improving her grades and reconnecting with healthier friends. She even joined a local volunteer program, helping at a community garden after school. Jerry couldn't help but feel proud as he watched her take responsibility for her life, fueled by her desire to change. One day, she handed him a brochure for a summer leadership program. "Do you think I could do this?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Jerry smiled, placing a reassuring hand on hers. "You can do anything, Laura. I believe in you." Laura's journey wasn't without challenges, but her determination inspired Jerry. Her resilience reminded him that while some bridges in their family might have burned, others were being rebuilt stronger than before. In the weeks following William's arrest and Laura's newfound focus, the Thornhill family began to show small but meaningful signs of growth. Conversations once filled with tension and avoidance became more open, albeit tentative. William, now attending mandatory rehab sessions, started to soften in his interactions with Jerry, though their relationship was far from healed. Laura, on the other hand, became a steady presence at home. She stepped into a supportive role for her brother, offering quiet encouragement without judgment. Her actions set an example, proving that change was possible even in the face of mistakes. Angela, humbled by the fallout of her choices, began putting in the effort to repair her relationship with the kids, though her interactions with Jerry remained distant. They found a way to co-parent with civility, prioritizing William and Laura's well-being. Jerry noticed a subtle shift one evening as the family sat in the living room. William working on a counseling assignment, Laura reading, and Angela quietly preparing tea. The silence felt different now, less like avoidance and more like a fragile truce. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. For the first time in a long time, there was a glimmer of hope in the Thornhill household. Jerry arrived at the Thanksgiving gathering hosted by an old friend, feeling a mix of reluctance and curiosity. His friend, Dave, had insisted he come, claiming it would do him good to get out and be around people who cared. The warm chatter of guests and the inviting aroma of roasted turkey greeted him as he stepped inside. "Jerry, glad you made it," Dave said, clapping him on the back. "There's someone I want you to meet." Jerry barely had time to protest before Dave led him toward a woman standing by the fireplace. She was talking animatedly to another guest, her Irish accent lilting and warm. When she turned to face him, Jerry noticed her vibrant green eyes and an easy smile that felt disarming. "Jerry, this is Maureen," Dave introduced. "Maureen, this is the friend I told you about." Maureen extended her hand, her grip firm and confident. "Nice to meet you, Jerry. Dave's spoken highly of you." "Hopefully not too highly," Jerry replied with a small smile, surprised at how natural it felt to joke. As the evening unfolded, Jerry found himself gravitating toward Maureen. They exchanged pleasantries over dinner, but it was her sharp wit and genuine interest in his stories that stood out. When she laughed, it wasn't polite or forced. It was the kind of laugh that made Jerry feel seen in a way he hadn't in years. By the time dessert was served, the initial awkwardness of introductions had melted away, replaced by a connection that felt unspoken but undeniable. Later in the evening, as the crowd thinned and the fire crackled in the hearth, Jerry found himself sitting with Morin in a quieter corner of the room. "So, Dave tells me you're going through a rough patch," Morin said gently, her gaze steady but kind. "Care to share? Or should I just fill in the blanks?" Jerry hesitated, but there was something about Morin's presence that felt safe. "It's not much of a secret at this point," he said, leaning back in his chair. "My wife, well, ex-wife, eventually had an affair. It's been a messy few months." Morin nodded, her expression softening. "I'm sorry. That's not an easy thing to go through." Jerry looked at her, curiosity piqued. "You sound like you might know a thing or two about that." She smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "You could say that. My husband, ex-husband, wasn't exactly a paragon of fidelity either. Let's just say I've seen my fair share of betrayals." For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the weight of shared pain hanging between them. Then Morin broke it with a wry chuckle. "Funny, isn't it? How someone else's choices can upend your whole world." Jerry nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Yeah. Funny isn't the word I'd use, though." Morin laughed, the sound genuine and light. "Fair enough. But here we are, survivors of the wreckage. Maybe that's worth something." As they continued talking, their stories began to overlap. Moments of heartbreak, anger, and the slow, painstaking process of rebuilding. For every wound they uncovered, there was a thread of hope, a reminder that they weren't defined by the betrayals they'd endured. By the end of the night, Jerry realized something unexpected. He wasn't just talking about his pain, he was sharing it. And in doing so, he felt lighter, as though a part of the burden had been lifted. Morin's honesty and humor weren't just comforting. They were a reminder that healing was possible even after the deepest wounds. When it was time to leave, Jerry found himself lingering by the door, reluctant to end the evening. Morin noticed and smiled softly. "We'll talk again, Jerry. I have a feeling about that." Jerry smiled and left, getting on the train back to his apartment. As he drove home, Jerry felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in months. It wasn't just the evening or the company. It was the possibility of something new, something healing on the horizon. The days following Thanksgiving unfolded with a gentle rhythm. Jerry and Morin began meeting regularly, their time together marked by a simplicity that felt comforting. Their favorite ritual quickly became evening walks through a local park, the crisp winter air invigorating as they wandered along the winding paths. The walks were peaceful in ways that Jerry had learned to be peaceful in the first. One evening, as they strolled under the soft glow of streetlights, Morin stopped to admire the bare branches of a tree silhouetted against the twilight sky. "There's something beautiful about this," she said, gesturing toward the stark scene. "Even in winter, when everything looks dead, it's just preparing for something new." Jerry glanced at her, struck by the way she seemed to find meaning in even the simplest things. "I never thought of it like that," he admitted. "I've been so focused on what I've lost. I guess I haven't thought much about what's ahead." Morin turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe it's time you did," she said softly. "The past doesn't have to define you." Their conversations often veered into topics that felt deeply personal, Morin sharing stories of her childhood in Ireland, Jerry recounting the dreams he'd once had of becoming a writer. The more they talked, the more Jerry found himself opening up, his guard slipping in ways he hadn't thought possible. One night, as they sat on a park bench watching the stars, Morin reached over and took Jerry's hand. "You don't have to do this alone, you know," she said, her voice steady and warm. "You deserve to have someone walk beside you." Jerry squeezed her hand, a lump forming in his throat. "I think I'm starting to believe that," he said quietly. As their bond deepened, Morin became a steady presence in Jerry's life, offering not just companionship but a perspective he hadn't considered before. She had a way of gently challenging his assumptions, helping him see that the walls he'd built to protect himself were also keeping him from moving forward. One evening over dinner at her place, the conversation turned to Jerry's marriage. "Do you still think about her?" Morin asked, not accusing but curious. Jerry set down his fork, considering her question. "I do," he admitted, "but not in the way I used to. It's more like trying to understand what went wrong, what I could have done differently." Morin nodded. "That's natural, but don't let it trap you. You're not the mistakes you made, and you're not the mistake she made." Her words stayed with him, echoing in his mind as he navigated the lingering shadows of his past. Morin's presence wasn't about fixing him. It was about reminding him that he wasn't broken beyond repair. On a snowy afternoon, they sat by her fireplace, Jerry reading aloud from one of his unfinished stories. When he finished, Morin smiled, her eyes bright. "You have a gift," she said simply, "and it's time you stopped hiding it." Her belief in him felt like a lifeline, pulling him further from the self-doubt that had anchored him for so long. Slowly but surely, Jerry began to let go of the bitterness and regret, replacing them with a quiet hope for the future. One night, as they stood by the window watching snow fall, Morin wrapped her arms around him from behind. "You're not the man you were when we met," she whispered. "You're stronger now, and it shows." Jerry turned, his gaze meeting hers. "It's because of you," he said, his voice steady. "You've shown me what it means to trust again." Morin smiled, resting her forehead against his. "Then I guess we're healing each other." In her arms, Jerry didn't just feel safe. He felt whole. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like a promise. The room was quiet, the soft hum of the lawyer's heater the only sound as Jerry and Angela sat across from one another. The divorce papers lay on the table between them, a stark symbol of the end of what had once been their shared life. Angela fidgeted with the pen in her hand, her eyes fixed on the document. Jerry sat still, his expression calm but tinged with sadness. "Never thought it would come to this," Angela said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, but the weight of her words lingered in the air. Jerry sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Neither did I," he admitted. "But here we are." Angela's gaze lifted to meet his, her eyes filled with a mix of regret and longing. "Do you think we could have done something differently? Saved it before it got this far?" Jerry paused, considering her question. "Maybe," he said finally, "but I think we both stopped trying long before this. We let too much go unsaid, ignored the cracks until they became too big to fix." Angela nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Jerry, for all of it, for the lies, the hurt, for losing sight of what we had." Jerry's throat tightened as he watched her struggle to hold back her tears. "I'm sorry too," he said, his voice low, "for not being the partner you needed, for missing the signs." But sorry doesn't change what's already happened. He held her close, and she briefly wrapped her arms around him to gently hold him close. My best, Jerry said, his voice threaded with emotion. Angela wiped her eyes, forcing a small, bittersweet smile. You were a good husband, Jerry. I know I didn't say it enough, but you were. And you were a good wife, Jerry replied, his voice tinged with sincerity. Until we stopped being good for each other. They sat in silence for a moment, the enormity of their shared history hanging between them. Finally, Angela picked up the pen, her hand trembling slightly as she signed the papers. She slid them toward Jerry, her eyes lingering on his face. Do you think we ever had a chance? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jerry hesitated before answering. We did, he said. But somewhere along the way, we both let it slip away. Angela nodded, her expression a mix of acceptance and sorrow. I hope you find happiness, Jerry. You deserve it. You too, Jerry said, meeting her gaze one last time. Take care of yourself, Angela. With that, the lawyer collected the papers, and the moment was final. As Jerry walked out of the office, he felt a mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a strange sense of closure. It wasn't the ending he had imagined, but it was the one they both needed to move forward. Jerry stood in the middle of the nearly empty bedroom, a box in his hands, scanning the walls that now felt foreign and bare. The echoes of laughter, arguments, and quiet moments played in his mind like faint whispers. And for a moment, he stood still, letting the memories wash over him. The last of his belongings were scattered around the room. A few books, a framed photo of William and Laura as kids, and an old jacket he had forgotten about. One by one, he placed them in the box, his movements slow and deliberate. Each item felt like a fragment of a life he was finally letting go of. As he closed the box, his gaze drifted to the window. Outside, the yard lay covered in frost. The swing set he had built for the kids now worn and empty. He remembered their laughter as they played, how Angela had called him in for dinner, and how life had felt simpler then. With a deep breath, Jerry picked up the box and headed downstairs. Angela wasn't home, by design, he suspected, but he left a note on the kitchen counter anyway. Thank you for the good times. Take care. As he stepped out the front door, the house loomed behind him, not as a symbol of failure, but as a chapter that had simply reached its end. Walking to his car, Jerry didn't look back. Instead, he focused on the road ahead, his heart lighter than it had been in years. William's time in rehab started rocky, marked by defiance and skepticism. He resisted the process at first, treating it as a punishment rather than an opportunity. But as the days turned into weeks, something began to shift. The structured environment forced him to confront his choices, and the group therapy sessions introduced him to others who had walked similar paths. Jerry visited William every weekend, their conversations initially stilted and guarded. Over time, however, William began opening up, sharing his struggles and regrets. One afternoon, during a family session, William finally admitted, I was angry at you, Dad. But I see now that you were just trying to help me. I don't want to disappoint you anymore. Jerry's chest tightened at the sincerity in his son's voice. I've always believed in you, William, he said, his voice steady. But you have to believe in yourself too. By the time William completed the program, he was no longer the angry, self-destructive teenager who had been arrested. He wasn't perfect, but there was a light in his eyes that Jerry hadn't seen in years. William enrolled in a local trade school, channeling his energy into learning a skill he was passionate about. It was a small step, but it was a step forward. While William was working through rehab, Laura's transformation continued to blossom. She threw herself into her schoolwork with a determination that surprised even her teachers. Her grades improved dramatically, and she began taking on leadership roles in her extracurricular activities. One evening, she sat across from Jerry at the table, a scholarship application in hand. "Dad," she said, her voice filled with both excitement and uncertainty, "I think I can actually get into a good college." Jerry smiled, pride evident in his eyes. "I know you can. You've worked so hard for this." As the months passed, Laura's confidence grew. She started a part-time job at a local bookstore, balancing work and school with ease. Her success became a beacon for the family, a sign of what was possible even in the aftermath of upheaval. During a quiet moment, she confided in Jerry. "You know, Dad, watching you rebuild your life made me realize I could do the same. You didn't let everything break you, and neither will I." Jerry's heart swelled at her words. "You inspire me just as much, Laura," he said. Her journey wasn't just a new beginning for her. It was a testament to the strength they had both found in each other. As the beautiful morning sun broke through the clouds, Jerry lifted Jerry into his arms. Angela, too, found herself reflecting on her choices and the damage they had caused. With the house feeling emptier than ever, she turned her energy toward fixing what she could. She repainted walls, repaired broken fixtures, and replaced furniture that carried too many painful memories. Each task, though small, felt like a step toward redemption. At work, she worked hard to rebuild her reputation, taking on additional responsibilities and mending strained relationships with colleagues. In the evenings, she volunteered at a local shelter, channeling her guilt into helping others. One day, while picking up the kids, Jerry noticed the freshly painted shutters and newly planted flowers in the front yard. "You've been busy," he remarked. Angela nodded, a faint smile on her face. "It's not just about fixing the house," she said quietly. "It's about fixing myself." Though their relationship had ended, Jerry couldn't help but admire her quiet determination. Angela was finding her purpose, and in doing so, she was proving that growth was possible even in the face of regret. The winding roads leading into Durango, Colorado, were lined with towering pines and snow-dusted peaks as Jerry drove toward his new home. He felt a sense of freedom that had eluded him for years. The small mountain town, with its charming streets and vibrant artistic community, felt like the perfect place to start over. The cabin he had rented was modest but inviting, nestled at the edge of a forest with a view of the mountains that stretched endlessly into the horizon. The first night, Jerry unpacked slowly, savoring the quiet and the clean, crisp air. Among the belongings he had brought was his laptop and a stack of journals filled with ideas and unfinished stories. The next morning, he set up a small writing nook by the window. Sunlight streamed in as he opened a blank document, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. For the first time in years, he wasn't weighed down by doubt or distraction. He began to write, not for anyone else, but for himself. Days turned into weeks, and Jerry's story started taking shape. He joined a local writers group, finding encouragement and camaraderie among others who shared his passion. For the first time, his dream of becoming a writer felt tangible, a reality he was finally embracing. One evening, Jerry sat on his porch, a mug of tea warming his hands as he watched the sun dip below the mountains. The quiet was profound, but it wasn't the emptiness he had feared. It was the kind of quiet that allowed him to reflect, to breathe, and to feel truly present. As the stars began to appear, Jerry thought about the path that had brought him here. The heartbreak, the anger, the moments of despair. They were all part of the story, chapters he couldn't erase but no longer needed to dwell on. Instead, he chose to see them as lessons, reminders of his resilience and capacity for growth. Morin's words echoed in his mind, "You're allowed to be happy." And for the first time, he believed it wholeheartedly. He had rebuilt his life on his own terms, embracing a new reality that felt both fulfilling and authentic. He thought of William and Laura, of the strides they were making, and of the quiet pride he felt in their growth. He thought of Angela, her journey of redemption a mirror of his own. They were all moving forward in their own ways, proof that even after the hardest falls, there was a chance to rise again. Jerry smiled, looking up at the night sky. His journey wasn't over. It never would be. But for now, he was at peace, and that was more than enough. The crisp mountain air carried the faint scent of pine as Jerry and Morin hiked up the trail, their laughter mingling with the rustling of leaves underfoot. The climb was steep, but the promise of the view at the summit spurred them on. For Jerry, this hike wasn't just about the scenery. It was about taking the next step in a journey he never thought he'd make again. As they reached the top, the vista spread out before them, breathtaking in its majesty. The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. Morin stepped to the edge, marveling at the beauty of it all. "It's perfect," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "It is," Jerry said, though his gaze was fixed on her, not the view. His heart pounded as he reached into his pocket, fingers brushing against the small velvet box. "Morin," he began, his voice steady but soft, "I didn't think I'd ever feel this way again. You've shown me what it means to trust, to love, and to hope. You've brought light back into my life." She turned to face him, her expression curious and tender. As Jerry dropped to one knee, her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with surprise. "I don't want to spend another day without you by my side," he said, opening the box to reveal a simple but elegant ring. "Morin, will you marry me?" Tears filled her eyes, and for a moment, she was too overcome to speak. Then she smiled, a radiant, unguarded smile that took Jerry's breath away. "Yes," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "1,000 times, yes." As he slipped the ring onto her finger and stood to embrace her, Jerry felt a profound sense of peace. This wasn't just the start of a new chapter. It was a promise that the pain of the past had finally made way for something beautiful. Sitting on the porch of his cabin that evening, Jerry watched as the stars began to dot the night sky. Morin sat beside him, her hand in his, the ring glinting faintly in the moonlight. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding and shared joy. Jerry's thoughts wandered to the path that had brought him here. There was a time when he thought his life was over, when betrayal and loss had seemed insurmountable. But as he reflected on the journey, he realized that every step, even the painful ones, had led him to this moment. The anger he once felt toward Angela and Clark had long since faded, replaced by a quiet acceptance. They were no longer the villains of his story, just characters in a chapter that had ended. The best revenge, he realized, wasn't anger or retribution. It was living a life filled with purpose, love, and authenticity. Jerry turned to Morin, her presence a tangible reminder of how far he'd come. He thought of William and Laura, of their resilience and growth, and of his own decision to chase his dreams instead of burying them. As the cool night air surrounded him, Jerry smiled. His story wasn't perfect, but it was his, a testament to the power of starting over, of finding hope in the ruins and building something even stronger. He squeezed Morin's hand gently. "The best part," he said aloud, his voice steady and warm, "is knowing that this is just the beginning." The stars above seemed to shine a little brighter as Jerry leaned back, content not just with where he was, but with the journey it had taken to get there. And for the first time in a long time, he felt truly whole. End of story.